Sometimes love ends not with shouting, betrayal, or explosive heartbreak, but in silence. A silence so deafening, it swallows everything that once made two people feel alive. This is the story of Ethan and Emily, a couple who had everything until they didn't. A signature was all it took to mark the death of a marriage, yet just minutes after the ink dried, fate threw them into a plot twist no one could have written. She collapsed in the cold, sterile room where their love officially ended. He rushed to her side, panic breaking through his normally impenetrable exterior. And what doctors would reveal next would not only shake him, it would rewrite the very ending he thought he had just sealed. Emily was pregnant, 3 months along, with Ethan's child, a baby conceived amidst chaos, confusion, and the slow breakdown of something that once felt eternal. But here's the catch. This isn't just a story about unexpected pregnancy or failed love. This is a story about power, redemption, control, vulnerability, and what it takes to truly change, not for a second chance, but to earn the right to stand beside someone you've already hurt. And it might just change how you see the ones you've let go. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to John's Stories channel for powerful emotional narratives like this every day. The scent of paper and bureaucracy hung in the air like dust in sunlight. Emily sat with her back rigid, facing the man she once swore forever to. Across the lifeless wooden table, Ethan sat stone-faced, his dark eyes unreadable, the stack of divorce papers separating them like a final symbolic wall. There was no tears, no final plea, just silence. And that was the worst part, because when there's nothing left to say, that's when it's truly over. Emily clenched the pen not because she was unsure, but because her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Her name was already printed on the document, bold and lifeless. She just had to sign, and so did he. Ethan picked up the pen like he was signing a business contract. No hesitation, no flicker of emotion. That was his strength and his curse. He was always composed, always in control. But as his signature met hers, something broke. Not between them, because what they had was already broken, but within her. When Emily stood, her world tilted sideways. A sharp ringing filled her ears, and before she could reach for balance, her knees buckled and she collapsed to the cold floor. The thud was like an explosion in Ethan's chest. For the first time in years, the man who prided himself on calm lost it. "Emily," he shouted, kneeling by her side, shaking her gently. "Talk to me." She didn't respond. Her lips were pale, her breathing shallow. Ethan cradled her head, his voice shaking as he barked for help. Registry office staff scrambled to call an ambulance, but to him it felt like the world had stopped. As they loaded her into the ambulance, he never let go of her hand. Here was the woman he had just legally separated from, and yet the idea of losing her tore through him in a way he couldn't rationalize. He thought he had closed this chapter, but watching her unconscious, fragile, pale, it felt like watching someone erase your favorite book in front of your eyes. At the hospital, antiseptic air mixed with the beeping of machines and the low murmur of nurses. Emily stirred, blinking against the white lights overhead. Her vision was blurry, her mind slow to catch up. But one thing was clear. Ethan was still there. His previously pristine suit was wrinkled, his tie undone, his eyes wide and haunted. Before she could speak, the doctor entered. "Miss Emily," he said gently, clipboard in hand, "your fainting was caused by a sudden drop in blood pressure, likely due to your condition." Emily frowned. "What condition?" The doctor hesitated, then offered a soft smile. "You're pregnant, about 12 weeks along. Congratulations." The room was silent, utterly still. Even the machine seemed to pause. Emily stared at him, blinking, like her brain couldn't process the words. Pregnant? No, that couldn't be right. She had dismissed the fatigue, the nausea. She had assumed it was the stress of the divorce, the emotional weight of years unraveling. But now it all made sense. The baby was real, inside her. Her eyes slowly drifted to Ethan, who had gone pale. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Because in that moment, everything between them shifted. The story they thought was over suddenly had a second chapter. Ethan took a step toward her, voice low. "This is our child, Emily." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a threat. It was a truth. Emily looked away. Her heart raced. She didn't want this complication. Not now. Not with him. "This changes nothing," she said, quietly, trying to sound firm, but her voice wavered, and Ethan noticed. He always noticed. The slightest tremor in her tone, the way her hands clutched the hospital sheets, the way her eyes refused to meet his. She was scared. Not of motherhood, not even of the future. She was scared of him, of what he still meant to her. Real-life echoes of this scene are more common than we think. I once spoke to a woman named Natalie who left a controlling partner after 5 years. They had been college sweethearts, raised a dog together, shared rent, and even planned a wedding that never happened. But it wasn't until she fainted from exhaustion and learned she was pregnant that she had to decide if she could rebuild something with the man who had broken her spirit. Her answer, like Emily's, wasn't simple. Back in the hospital room, Ethan took another step forward. Emily caught the scent of his cologne, a scent that once made her feel safe, a scent that still lived in her bedsheets even after he moved out. And she hated how familiar it still felt. "I don't need you for this, Ethan," she said. Her voice was stronger now, defensive. But he didn't back down. "I'm not here to interfere. I'm here because I'm the father." She turned away, arms folded. He knew that look, that wall she always built when she felt cornered. "Do you really think you can shut me out of this?" he asked. "I don't know what I'm doing. I just need time." It was the first honest thing she had said to him in months. And to his surprise, he didn't push, he didn't lecture or argue. He just said, "I'm not going anywhere." That terrified her more than anything else. Because despite all the pain, despite all the history, a part of her still wanted to believe him. Emily closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the storm brewing inside her chest. Ethan's voice echoed in her ears, not for its tone, but for the calm insistence in it. "I'm not going anywhere." It sounded like a promise, but promises had always been easy for him to make, and devastating for her to believe. Their history wasn't laced with fireworks and drama. It had been a slow erosion of freedom, of choices, of her identity. Ethan had never raised his voice. He never needed to. A glance, a small sigh, or a carefully chosen phrase was enough to make her second-guess herself. "You don't need to work. I can provide everything for us." "That dress is a bit revealing, don't you think? I just want what's best for you." In the early days, she'd mistaken it all for care, for attention, for love. But slowly, over the years, his love had started to feel like a cage lined with silk. It looked beautiful from the outside, but inside, it suffocated. So when she asked for space the first time, he laughed, like she had just told him she wanted to live on Mars. The second time, he changed the subject. The third time, when she finally uttered the word divorce, he had stared at her in silence before muttering, "I don't know what else you want from me. I gave you everything." But that was the problem. It had always been him giving, and her receiving. She had been a recipient of his life, not a partner in it. Back in the hospital, Ethan was still standing near her bed, unsure whether to reach for her hand or step away. The lines between them were no longer legal documents, they were emotional landmines. "I don't hate you," Emily whispered. He blinked. "Then what?" "That's the problem," she said, her voice barely audible. "I wish I did. It would make this easier." He stepped back as if her words had weight, and in a way they did. Not hating someone you're trying to walk away from is a curse, because it leaves space for hope. And hope is dangerous. Ethan had always lived by logic. His world was built on clear expectations and outcomes. But now he stood in unfamiliar territory, where love wasn't a chess match, where the queen had left the board and the king no longer knew how to move. He crossed his arms across his chest, posture tight. He said, "I can't fix the past, but I can be here now." Emily didn't respond. Her gaze fell to the floor, to the white linoleum that somehow felt more stable than his presence. "You don't believe I've changed," he said, watching her. She inhaled deeply and exhaled even slower. "I think you want to be someone else, but I don't know if it's for me or for you." And that was a question few people asked in the aftermath of heartbreak. Do people change because they've grown, or because they want to win someone back? The days after the hospital visit blurred into a haze of fatigue and routine. Emily, now aware of the life growing inside her, found herself making choices not for herself anymore, but for the child. Prenatal appointments, supplements, rest. Ethan didn't push. He didn't demand answers or timelines. He was just there. When morning sickness struck, he'd leave a bland cracker pack and a bottle of water on her doorstep, then disappear before she woke. When she had a migraine, he'd text, "I'm downstairs with ginger tea, no pressure." And slowly, the quiet presence of a man who once loomed like a shadow now felt more like a lighthouse, distant, constant, guiding, but not controlling. One cold evening after a long workday, Emily stepped out of her office to find Ethan leaning against his car. His arms were folded, his jaw tense. "What are you doing here?" she asked, clutching her coat tighter. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest." She didn't respond. "Do I have a chance?" he asked softly. Emily looked away, her breath fogging the winter air. "I don't know." "Then I'll wait." His words weren't filled with desperation. They didn't feel like a plea. They were simple, clear. That night, for the first time since everything unraveled, Emily cried. Not because she was sad, but because she was finally allowed to feel again. She let him walk her to her door. She accepted the coffee he handed her the next morning. She let him carry the grocery bag when her arms were full. Small acts of presence, not dominance. And he never asked for anything in return. Real stories like this are more common than we think, but rarely told. I met a man named Trevor at a writer's retreat in Oregon. He told me how he lost his wife after years of passive control, not shouting or cheating, but through silence, withdrawal, and decisions made for her own good. When she left, he didn't chase her. He became a different man, not to win her back, but because he hated who he'd become. Years later, she returned, not because he asked her to, but because she saw the change without him ever announcing it. Back to Emily. Just as things began to settle into a cautious rhythm, everything unraveled again. It was a regular day, a prenatal checkup. The baby was healthy. Emily felt a rare sense of peace as she walked outside. She spotted Ethan across the street. She smiled automatically until she saw his expression darken. He walked towards her, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Who was that guy?" he asked. Emily frowned. "What guy? The one you were talking to in the lobby?" She blinked. "An old friend. We bumped into each other." "Oh, right," he said, the edge in his voice unmistakable. "A coincidence, like the ones that used to happen before." Her chest tightened. "Ethan, no." He cut her off, his voice rising slightly. "The same guy who always waited for me to screw up so he could swoop in. You still trust people like that?" Her face fell. The past had returned, not through action, but tone, accusation, mistrust. The very poison that once ruined them. "I'm not doing this again," she said coldly. He realized his mistake too late. She was already walking away. He tried to stop her. "You said I changed." "You promised you changed," she said over her shoulder. "But you don't get to be a better man only when it's convenient." That night, he came to her apartment. The lights were off. A neighbor said she had rented the apartment out for a few months, said she was traveling. Emily was gone. Really gone this time. And this time, she didn't leave a door cracked open behind her. Ethan stood outside the apartment building, breath visible in the night air. For once, he didn't know what to do. He couldn't plan or calculate. All the control he'd clung to his entire life meant nothing now. Weeks passed. No calls, no messages, no signs of her. And then the call came. A number lit up on his phone in the middle of the night. St. Jude Medical Center. He picked up, already breathless. "Mr. Ethan?" "Yes, what happened?" "It's about Emily. You need to come now." The hospital smelled the same as before. Sterile, cold, filled with fluorescent light and quiet dread. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he approached the reception desk, a sensation that felt entirely foreign to a man who prided himself on composure. When the nurse directed him to the maternity ICU, his heart nearly burst through his chest. "Condition is delicate," they told him. Delicate. The word looped in his head like a cruel chant. It meant nothing and everything. It was the kind of word doctors used to avoid saying worse ones. It was the same kind of word he used to use in business meetings, non-committal, vague, and devastatingly effective. The minutes crawled by, stretching into an eternity. Sitting in the hallway outside her room, Ethan stared at the tiled floor, trying to hold himself together. For a man who once thought love was weakness, it was humbling to realize that now, love was the only thing keeping him upright. Inside that room, behind a door he wasn't allowed to open yet, was the woman who had walked out of his life and taken a part of him with her. He couldn't strategize his way out of this. He couldn't fix her with grand gestures. There were no second chances if fate decided it was done playing fair. And then the door opened. A nurse stepped out, followed by a quiet hum of monitors still beeping inside. Ethan stood. "She's stable," the nurse said gently. "She's very weak, but she and the baby, they're both okay." He didn't move at first. The words didn't register immediately. And then, she survived. Emily was alive. So was their child. When he entered the room, the sight of her nearly dropped him to his knees. She was pale, eyes heavy with exhaustion. But she was there. Her presence, though frail, was undeniable. Their eyes met. It wasn't relief she offered him, not entirely. It was something more complex. There was gratitude in her gaze, yes, but also confusion, and a subtle wall that still hadn't come down. She whispered, "You chose the baby." Ethan stepped closer. "I chose what you would have chosen." That single moment, those few words, said more than any vow he had ever spoken. Because this time, his decision wasn't about control. It wasn't about his pride or his plan. It was about her, about choosing the thing that mattered most to her even when she wasn't awake to fight for it. The next few months blurred into a stream of healing and change. Emily had a long recovery ahead. The emergency had been a placental abruption brought on by stress. The baby, a boy, had spent weeks in neonatal observation, but he grew stronger by the day. They named him Matthew, a name Emily had once casually mentioned in passing when they were still married. He remembered. He didn't try to rename him. He didn't even suggest alternatives. For once, he didn't challenge her choices. He just stood by them. And that, strangely, became the first sign that something inside him had shifted. This wasn't the same man who had dismissed her needs for years. This wasn't the man who calculated outcomes and defended his ego to the death. This Ethan was quieter, present, patient, and he never asked for forgiveness. He didn't push for anything. He didn't try to resume where they left off. He just waited. When Emily struggled to carry the baby bag into the car, he appeared silently and took it from her hand. When she returned from appointments, exhausted and emotional, he didn't offer solutions. He offered tea. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't performative. It was real. And Emily noticed. She noticed how, for the first time in years, her choices were hers alone. Ethan didn't fill the silences with suggestions or challenge her instincts. He watched, supported, and left space. It was disarming. Because Ethan had always been about control, and now he was about trust. I remember once hearing a therapist say, the hardest part of healing from an emotionally imbalanced relationship isn't the absence of love, it's learning to trust peace when you've lived so long inside chaos. That was Emily's reality. She had adapted to imbalance. Now this calm felt suspicious. So she watched Ethan closely. She observed how he held Matthew, not like a man performing fatherhood, but like someone discovering it, layer by layer. She watched his hands, once rigid with certainty, now trembling slightly as they adjusted the baby's cap. She caught the way he whispered nonsense to our son in the early mornings, thinking she couldn't hear him. One day, their arms brushed as they both reached for a bottle. It was such an insignificant touch, and yet Emily's heart skipped. Because the skin remembers, and so does the soul. When she looked up, he was already watching her. They held that gaze for several seconds. A quiet question floated in the space between them. Could we ever be us again? But Emily looked away. Not yet. Still, something had changed. She was no longer running. She was simply walking at her own pace. That was new. But time, as it tends to do, was running ahead of them. That night, after putting Matthew to sleep, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He asked for nothing, but he leaned in, gently kissed her forehead, and stepped back. And that's when Emily finally understood something essential. They weren't rebuilding a relationship because they needed each other. They were beginning again because they wanted each other. That was the difference. Not convenience, not desperation. Desire. Mutual choice. In my experience, the strongest relationships aren't always the ones that last uninterrupted. They're often the ones that fall apart and are rebuilt with new bricks. Not because the old ones were bad, but because the foundation had to change. That's what happened here. Ethan had finally learned that love isn't about control, it's about freedom. And Emily? She learned that vulnerability is only dangerous when handed to the wrong person. The right one guards it like treasure.
The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Emily's apartment, casting golden streaks across the floor. The scent of oatmeal and cinnamon drifted from the kitchen where Ethan was humming a lullaby, absent-mindedly, almost uncharacteristically, as he fed Matthew tiny spoonfuls. It was domestic, ordinary, and profoundly surreal. Emily stood at the doorframe, quietly watching him. She hadn't planned to let him stay over. It had just happened. A late-night fever in Matthew. Ethan had come over to help, and when the crisis passed, no one had the energy to untangle themselves from the moment. But now, as she watched him move through her kitchen like he belonged there, something deeper stirred. Not the blind passion that once made her overlook the cracks in their relationship, but something calmer, steadier, built on observation, patience, and evidence. That was what mattered most. Consistency. He wasn't perfect. She didn't expect him to be. But day by day, Ethan had shown her something more valuable than declarations or promises. He had shown up. And that, to a woman who once begged to be heard, meant everything. Still, the walls she had built didn't crumble overnight. Healing is not linear. There were moments when old fears crept in, when his silence made her wonder if judgment lurked underneath, when a small sigh would echo a time he'd tried to control her with disappointment. But something was different now. When she expressed those fears aloud, he didn't defend himself. He listened. He said, "You have every right to feel that way." He said, "I'm not here to prove anything overnight. I just want to earn tomorrow." That line stayed with her. I just want to earn tomorrow. One afternoon, she found herself telling him about a new job opportunity, a position she had once dreamed of, but one that would take her to another city for a few weeks of training. Ethan didn't flinch. "Take it," he said without hesitation. "I'll help however I can." She studied his face for traces of old patterns, resentment, manipulation, guilt. There was none. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because you deserve a life that's yours." Emily looked away quickly, not wanting him to see her eyes well up. Because that was it. That was the one thing she had needed for years. Not perfection, not flowers, not grand gestures, just freedom. And someone who respected it. She accepted the job. He watched Matthew while she was away, sent her updates, never once crossed a line, never once used his time with their son as leverage. Instead, he became what he never had the courage to be before: a real partner, a steady parent, a present man. And it didn't go unnoticed. On her first night back, she didn't sleep in her room. She didn't say anything. She just walked into the living room where Ethan was dozing with Matthew on his chest, gently picked up their son, placed him in the crib, and returned to sit beside Ethan on the couch. He opened one eye, sleep-blurred, confused. "Do you want to stay the night?" she asked, almost timidly. He nodded, afraid words would break the moment. They didn't kiss, not that night, but something much deeper passed between them, mutual permission to try again. In the weeks that followed, they didn't make a big announcement. There were no social media posts, no declarations to family. It was private, sacred, something they were rebuilding from the inside, piece by piece. They went to counseling, not because something was broken, but because they both wanted tools to prevent old habits from resurfacing. They took turns with midnight feedings. They argued, but gently. They laughed, but not like before. It was a different kind of laughter now, one born not of flirtation, but of familiarity. Real life had returned, but this time it didn't feel like a threat. One spring evening, they went for a walk with Matthew in a stroller. The air smelled like honeysuckle, and birds chirped from trees that had just begun to bloom. "I don't know what the future holds," she said suddenly, not looking at him. Ethan didn't rush to reassure her. He didn't say, "Don't worry," or "We're fine." He said, "I don't either, but I'm walking toward it with you." That was the night she kissed him again. Not out of impulse, not out of longing, but out of love. Because she finally believed him, and maybe more importantly, she believed herself. So, what's the takeaway here? Is it that love always deserves a second chance? No, not always. Some people don't change. Some wounds don't heal. Some goodbyes are permanent, for good reason. But this story isn't about the kind of love that bends until it breaks. It's about the kind of love that shatters and then gets reassembled, stronger, wiser, gentler. If you're watching this and you've walked away from someone you once thought you'd grow old with, remember this: leaving isn't failure. Sometimes it's the first courageous act of love toward yourself. But if they come back changed, not for you, but for themselves. If they come back with open hands instead of closed fists, with understanding instead of defenses, and if your heart is healed enough to listen again, then maybe, just maybe, the story's not over. Maybe, like Emily and Ethan, it's only just beginning again. Love is not about proving someone wrong. It's about showing up differently the second time, because now you know better. You don't get the same love twice, but if you're lucky, you get a better version the second time. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, please consider subscribing to John's Stories for more emotional narratives that remind us of the messy, beautiful, and complicated nature of the human heart. We publish new content every day, stories that make you feel, think, and maybe heal. Until next time, take care of your heart.